Hey everyone, this is an obituary by Ian Birchall of Michael Kidron, who lived from 1930 to 2003. This obituary is from 2003. So here we go. The death of Michael Kidron, so soon after the loss of Tony Clift, Duncan Hallis, and Jim Higgins, robs us of yet another of the older generation who built and educated the International Socialists, subsequently the Socialist Workers' Party in the 1960s. I first heard Kidron speak at a student meeting in Oxford in the autumn of 1962. I was a campaign for nuclear disarmament supporter sympathizing with the labor left but unimpressed by the theoretical standards of the Tribunites. As I listened to Kidron analyze the current state of capitalism, I was dazzled. This man really understood how the world worked, and I grasped that it was possible to be a revolutionary and intellectually rigorous at the same time. Kidron's concluding challenge has remained lodged in my skull for over 40 years. Historically, revolutions have followed wars. In the nuclear age, we must reverse the order. Kidron was above all associated with the theory of, quote, permanent arms economy, which claimed that arms production was waste or luxury production and therefore, for a time, retarded the fall in the rate of profit and made possible the long post-war boom. For the genesis of the theory and the respective contributions of Vance, Oakes, Cliff, and Kidron, see Chris Harman Explaining the Crisis, published in 1984. The theory has been much criticized, but on the essentials, Kidron was proved right. In the early 1960s, the overwhelming majority of the left believed capitalism had overcome its contradictions and that mass unemployment was gone forever. Meanwhile, some benighted elements still talked of, quote, absolute pauperization and, quote, impending slumps. Against both, Kidron insisted that the boom was indeed real but would not last forever. Kidron's prediction from 1961 has been amply justified by subsequent history. Quote, whatever the future holds, it is one of irreparable instability, of crises whose violence is such as to question the continued existence of capitalism as a world system at best, or at worst of civilization itself. End quote. Kidron, International Socialism, number 7. For young socialists and students radicalized by the campaign for nuclear disarmament, the theory linked the struggle against nuclear weapons to the fight against capitalism, a link summed up in the IS slogan, quote, the fight against the bomb is a fight against the boss, end quote. It is, in its most extended version, Western Capitalism Since the War, published in 1968, Kidron's theory encompassed planning, inflation, the decline of reformism, and changing patterns of working-class struggle. Almost equally important was his critique of Lenin's theory of imperialism, highest stage but one, published in International Socialism, number 9. Kidron characterized Lenin's pamphlet as, quote, supremely good theory, end quote, for its own time, but showed that it no longer fitted the facts of the world 4 decades later. The follow-up, International Capitalism, published in International Socialism number 20, used the analysis to attack the third worldism so widespread on the 1960s left. Kidron concluded, quote, to believe nowadays that the short route to revolution in London, New York, or Paris lies through Calcutta, Havana, or Algiers is to pass the buck to where it has no currency, ... The greatest service we can render international socialism is to help stoke up the fires at home, end quote. Kidron. Interestingly, Kidron noted that Portugal was still, quote, old model imperialist, end quote. 10 years later, colonial revolt was to bring this imperialist country to the edge of revolution, end parenthesis. Kidron's work as theoretician was paralleled by his activity as editor. In the late 1950s, he edited Socialist Review, the organ of the tiny group of the same name. Though the paper had only a few dozen members behind it, Kidron used it to debate with the mainstream left, for example, in vigorous discussion on the subject of wages policy, which he had already spotted would become a key issue in the 1960s, involving himself, Eric Heffer, John Hughes, and Ken Alexander. See Socialist Review, April 1959 to April 1960. But Kidron's great editorial achievement was the first 20 issues of International Socialism. Between 1960 and 65, the journal was founded as an explicitly Marxist rival to New Left Review, also launched in 1960. In 1961, in his article, Revolution Again, ! Published in New Left Review number 6, Edward Thompson took Kidron to task for excessive invocation of the working class. Kidron responded with a letter in which he argued, quote, to my mind, International Socialism is geared to action. New Left Review is not, end quote. The journal initially attempted to regroup non-Heliite currents of the Trotskyist-derived left. The editorial board included at various times Ken Coates of the Fourth International, quote, Martin Granger, end quote, of Solidarity, the Dunayevskayaite, Harry McShane, and even a proto-Posadist, Theo Melville. The alliance could not hold together in the factionalized atmosphere of the period, and from 1963 International Socialism became simply the theoretical journal of the International Socialism Group. The group changed its name from Socialist Review to International Socialism in December 1962, apparently recognizing that the journal, rather than agitational publications, was the most attractive public face of the organization. The wealth of material in the first 20 issues of International Socialism provided a splendid education for anyone new to Marxism. There were core articles designed to arm cadres for the arguments in the Young Socialist, an extended debate on revolution and left reformism involving Kidron, Alster, McIntyre, and the historian Henry Collins. Cliff on, quote, substitutionism, permanent revolution, the Sino-Soviet split in Deutscher, and Kidron himself on imperialism and international capitalism, while Ken Coates and Sergio Junco, Sam Farber, presented alternative views of the Cuban Revolution. Their articles introducing us to hitherto unknown territory, Peter Sedgwick on Victor Serge, Erich Gerlach on Korsch, Jim Higgins on British Trotskyism, and Hal Draper's magnificent Two Souls of Socialism. Although, indeed because, International Socialism had no truck with, quote, international secretariats, end quote, of any provenance, there were many international contributors: Jean-Jacques Marie on Gaullism, Paul Cardin, Castoriadis on Socialism and Capitalism, Jean-Francois Lyotard on Algeria, Kenichi Kuroda on the Japanese Revolutionary Left, George Rawlick on the American Negro Movement, and documents from the Socialist League of Africa written by Barak Hirson. The book reviews helped to develop a new generation of International Socialism writers, among them Chris Harman and Nigel Harris. Kidron contributed frequently, often under the name David Breen, but there were also other names which subsequently cropped up in a variety of places on the political and intellectual spectrum: Barry Hindus, Hilary Rose, Ian Taylor, John Carina, Mary Kay Wilmers, J.P. Nuttall, who wrote the big biography of Rosa Luxemburg, and Richard Hyman. There were drawings by Abu, a collection of songs with teeth edited by Bobby Campbell, including Eric Morse's immortal Workers' Bomb, a short story by H. Orlando Patterson, and magnificent covers by Reuben Fior, two of which were included in an exhibition of design and art direction at the Hilton Hotel. It was a team effort, but without Kidron, the team would not have existed, and the editor's whimsical sense of humor was always present. But who but Kidron could have written a piece on drug company profits and the arms economy and call it Arms, Drugs, and Boomsadaisy? Editorials helped to steer comrades through a difficult period. The Labour Party conference voted in 1960 against Hugh Gaitskell for unilateral nuclear disarmament. Amid the general euphoria of the left, Kidron's editorial struck a sour note, warning that it was, quote, easy to exaggerate the extent of victory, end quote, and arguing that if the victory were not to be reversed, the left must learn to break down, quote, the high stakes of nuclear diplomacy into the small chips of class struggle, end quote. See Labor and the Bomb, featured in International Socialism number 3. This may have seemed pessimistic, but after the right's success in 1961, it offered the best logic for continuing the struggle. Kidron was not infallible. Sometimes Kidron's desire to grasp the wood as a totality led him to regard mere trees as an unnecessary distraction. In 1963 or 1964, as a very junior member of the editorial board, I suggested an editorial on Vietnam. Kidron looked at me with wondering scorn and said, quote, "You mean that little war, that silly little war?" end quote. Vietnam always perplexed Kidron. His own intelligence was so powerful that he found it hard to understand why ruling classes should act so stupidly. In 1965, Kidron contributed to a column to the Fortnightly Labor Worker under the name Frat Kane, in which he attempted to orient a new generation recruited through the Young Socialists to the novel experience of a labor government. In his first piece, he argued that Tribune might be renamed the Weekly Whisper, and concluded, quote, "I would hate to see the government topple meaninglessly or because business becomes restive, but if it falls because workers organize against wage freeze and refuse the business-backed policies labor is handing out, I should welcome it," end quote. Kidron produced a document opposing Cliff's organizational proposals during the debate on democratic centralism in 1968, entitled "We Are Not Peasants," reproduced in Jim Higgins' More Years for the Locust, published in London 1997. He did not oppose democratic centralism in principle, but rather suggested an intermediate organizational form to fit the changing needs of international socialism. He continued to provoke controversy. In 1968, Kidron reviewed Ernest Mandel's Marxist economic theory under the title Maginot-Marxism, published in International Socialism number 36, arguing that Mandel was, quote, "more concerned with defending Marx's category of analysis than with applying them," end quote. Mandel responded with a pamphlet entitled The Inconsistencies of State Capitalism. Inside International Socialism, the undeclared faction around David Jaffa, later the Revolutionary Communist Group, made Kidron's economics a particular target of their polemics. Kidron replied acidly, quote, "As every Torah has its Talmud, every program has its Jaffa," end quote. It might be Yaff, I'm not sure. There was always a degree of tension between Kidron and his brother-in-law Tony Cliff. By the side of Cliff's relentless focus on the unity of theory and practice, Kidron's more relaxed style and broader culture could seem somewhat dilettante. Yet between 1955 and 1968, they worked closely together on the basis of mutual respect. As Cliff told me, quote, "I've had many rows with Mike because he is worth it," end quote. Kidron became somewhat less central to the organization after 1968, though Kidron continued to speak and write for it. Early in 1975, Cliff and Jim Higgins proposed to bring Kidron back as editor of International Socialism, now monthly. I was summoned to Cliff's home and harangued for an hour about why I must vote for Mike. I didn't. He was appointed, but a deep split in the leadership now emerged and he was replaced before taking office. Though he did some speaking for a year or two more, this is really the end of the road. It is unclear exactly when Kidron left International Socialism. Nothing was more alien to Kidron's nature than the classic Trotskyist procedure of the noisy split followed by denunciation of former comrades. By now, Kidron was increasingly involved alongside Richard Cooper in Pluto Press. Pluto had originally been established as a semi-autonomous publishing house for International Socialism, but as the 1970s unfolded, the political priorities of a small revolutionary organization seeking influence in the working class increasingly diverged from those of a left-wing publishing house trying to ensure commercial survival. There were failures to lays and faults on both sides. By the end of the 1970s, there was complete divorce between Pluto and the Socialist Workers' Party. In 1977, Kidron contributed a critique of some of his earlier positions to the 100th issue of the journal he had founded entitled Two Insights Don't Make a Theory, published in International Socialism number 100. Michael Kidron now argued that the post-war boom had happened, quote, despite the arms economy, not because of the arms economy, end quote. More seriously, Kidron claimed that the role of trade unions had changed so much that, quote, a political strategy structured around them is bound to fail, end quote. This implied rejection of the rank-and-file strategy pursued by the Socialist Workers' Party. Thus ended Kidron's 20 years in the organized revolutionary movement. For an overview of his whole life, see Richard Cooper's excellent obituary in The Guardian from the 27th of March 2003. But in Kidron's published writings and his unpublished work, Kidron left behind a 750,000-word manuscript. Kidron continued to preserve the understanding of capitalism as a total system. Last year, Kidron contributed a final article to the Socialist Workers' Party Journal, Falling Growth and Rampant Costs, Two Ghosts in the Machine of Modern Capitalism. Kidron examined the role of waste in modern capitalism. Here we're still the same penetrating intelligence, the same playful humor, and the same indignation at the irrational system we live in. Kidron ended with the delightful and utterly Kidronesque image of a married couple. He, a tax inspector, she, a tax avoidance accountant, whose endless labors were, quote, mutually canceling, end quote. Their son, neglected by his hard-working parents, becomes a vandal. Death prevented further collaboration, but all of us who learned some of our Marxism from Mike Kidron will continue to be indebted to him. That's the end of the piece. Thank you for listening.